Well, I think our service can begin tonight. There'll be no laying on of hands, but there will be a lecture. I'd like to thank you all for coming to tonight's lecture, sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum is now in its third year of business, and we're pleased to continue to be able to bring to Ohio University speakers whose views are not always given a wide hearing at this or other university campuses. The Washington Forum is a forum for contrarians, and for contrarians willing to argue their views publicly and to debate their opponents openly, forthrightly, and civilly. That we can bring contrarians to campus at all is thanks not to the largesse of the state, but to the generous donations of Ohio University alumni and from private foundations. Tonight's lecture in particular is made possible thanks to grants from the Charles Koch Foundation and the Apgar Foundation, both of which I'd like to thank for their generosity. It's a great pleasure tonight to be able to introduce you to someone who's made a career calling out what he takes to be vapid, banal, the fuzzy-headed, and the ludicrous. Michael Bentley comes to us from the University of St Andrews in Scotland, where he's professor of modern history. He took his undergraduate degree at Sheffield before coming to Cambridge, where he did his graduate work at Peterhouse with Maurice Cowling, himself a scholar with a visceral aversion to cant in all its forms. In his writings, Bentley has focused broadly on two subjects. In 3 books and many more articles, he's anatomized the intellectual world of 19th century British politics with both clarity and an ability, noted repeatedly by reviewers, to understand and present the world as his subjects themselves understood it. For the last 2 decades, Bentley has worked on the history of histories. He edited the mammoth Companion to Historiography, to which he contributed a book-length introduction. In addition, he gave the Wiles Lectures at Belfast, which turned into Modernizing England's Past, English Historiography in the Age of Modernism. And earlier this year, he delivered the prestigious Prothero Lecture before the Royal Historical Society in London. His most recent book, just out from Cambridge University Press, is The Life and Thought of Herbert Butterfield, History, Science, and God. Bentley is currently on a 3-year research leave, thanks to a Leverhulme Major Trust Fellowship, during which he's writing a comparative historiography of the modern West. It's a project pursued across 3 continents and in 6 languages at least. It's also a project whose conclusions about what is constituted and what it continues to constitute the West will be bracing and will challenge a number of received orthodoxies. I'll leave it to Bentley to explain tonight what those orthodoxies are and why we're wrong to believe them in his lecture, The West, Reflections on the Making of a Past. It's recently been complained of Bentley that he, like Butterfield, finds cynicism and hardness far more attractive than any hint of soft pleasantries or piety. I suspect he'd take that as a compliment. I also suspect that it's more rightly said of Bentley what Bentley himself said of Maurice Cowling. He intended to interfere with the heads of those around him and to make them see the world differently. That's precisely the sort of speaker who's most welcome at the Washington Forum, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Michael Bentley here to Ohio University.
Is that better? Yeah? Okay. I must get used to that. I'm like the Sundance Kid. I'm better when I move, but I'll stand here. My first thoughts are obviously thoughts of gratitude to Robert in particular for this very kind invitation to be here. I've had a lovely day, talking to faculty and students, sitting in on a seminar. It's a lovely opportunity for me to see something of the Midwest, which I don't know at all. And I'm having a very happy stay with you, so thank you all for your kindness. Would you stand it if I began with something really rather personal, and that's explaining where I'm at with what I'm doing in this project, because it locates really what I want to think about a little bit this evening with you. England is currently bathed in economic depression, rather like your country. There is one golden piece of light for academics, and it is this thing which Robert mentioned in his introduction, the Leverhulme Trust. Now, Lever, later Lord Leverhulme, made squillions of money out of selling soap. And he did all the things that great industrialists do. He built an entire town around his works, which is called Port Sunlight. Sunlight was the name of the soap. When he died, he left a colossal sum of money in trust. And the deal is this: you can apply competitively to get a period of time out of your university on sabbatical leave, 6 months, a year, if you've got a good project, 2 years. But there are very, very few of them which give you the magical 3 years. In 2009, I put in a cheeky and speculative application for one of these things, and to my amazement, I got it. But of course, as all of you know who are faculty here, unless you apply to do something impossible, you don't get the money, and then when you've got the money, you can't do it because it's impossible. And that's the situation in which I now find myself. I offered them a comparative historiography of the West since the Enlightenment. It can't be done, but I do have the money. The reason I got into this was out of a kind of resentment, and it was a resentment about what we in the present are feeling about the West, however you want to conceive that, and what we're doing to the past of the West. And the reason that I got upset about it was that it seemed to me that the present, our present, was overmastering what we write about the West's past. And by the West, I mean whatever you think the West is. There's no point arguing about precise territories. It's a conceptual idea anyway. It's not a spatial idea. But whatever you think it is, it's going through, as it seems to me, some sort of crisis of confidence. We are apologetic about our culture. There's a good case, it seems to me, for saying that Western civilization has produced possibly the greatest civilization ever seen on the planet. You wouldn't think that when we speak to one another. We seem to want to apologize for the Crusades. We want to apologize to every oppressed nation. And of course, terrible things have been done by the West in its past. We all know that. But our present seems to be taking over what we want to say about this extraordinarily rich civilization. And I began to wonder whether something slightly more modulated, something slightly richer, could be said. In particular, I didn't like the idea that the West is a unitary place, a unitary construction. And the more we globalize our history, and that's what we're doing at the moment, the more we bring into play processes and large forces that seem to me to have the effect of making the West seem like a single thing, a single entity, rather than a multiplicity of all sorts of very different things. And it was difference that began to attract me. Is it possible to think about the West in a way that emphasizes difference rather than similitude? You see, in our present, we are dominated by vast forces. Modernization, technology, globalization. Huge processes that are then brought into play when people think about the past. So what we're tending to do now is to see the roots of the West in those very processes. Historians are already beginning to trace modernization further and further back as a process. We've pushed back globalization, first of all to the 16th century with Wallerstein and others, but now all the way back to the 13th century. It's as though historians are wanting to create a past that looks very like our present, to find the roots of the West in our roots, what we're doing, how we are portraying ourselves, how we imagine ourselves. Now, of course, that's inevitable. It's not necessarily something to bemoan. But I thought that the consequences of it was that we are far too prone to think about the territories of the West, whatever they are, in the terms of sameness. They're all trending on one conveyor belt from a past that has now been discovered towards a present that we all know. And I wanted to think about unhinging that and thinking about, can we provide a critique of the present in which we find ourselves? And if so, what contribution can historians make towards forming such a critique? Is it possible that the past can tell us something that would help us understand our condition better? Could we, in return, do something to enhance the richness of the past and get away from this rather stultifying sameness model that began to oppress me in 2009? Well, that's what I've been doing. I've been reading quite a lot of the historical writing of a number of countries throughout Western Europe, in North and South America, to try and form a sense of how to break down this sense of the mastery of the present that operates. And really what I want to talk about this evening is that process, the mastery of the present over the past, and to ask whether there's anything that the past can do to overmaster the present. And I don't mean that trivially. The trivial way of doing that is to become a reactionary, a deep conservative, and to appeal to things like nostalgia, and to say, we're going down the tubes, we're going to the dogs, this is a terrible civilization, we should revert to an older civilization. That's not what I've got in mind at all. What I mean is, can the study of the past illuminate our present condition? And my answer is going to be, when I get there, that I think there's a way in which it can, but it's not a way necessarily that the historians are going to show us. It's a way that the historiographers are going to show us. So that means I have to begin by thinking a little bit about historiography. And what do we mean by it? The most obvious definition of the term historiography, and the undergraduates in the room I'm sure have already been introduced to the idea in 101 or something or other. The most obvious way to think about it is what is in the terms of what the philosophers call a lexicographical definition. That is to say, the definition you would find in the dictionary. And that's easy. Historiography is simply the set of all historical writing about everything ever. It's just whatever has been written. You can talk about the historiography of a specific person. You can talk about the historiography of the American Revolution or the French Revolution. You can talk about the historiography of tractors if you want. But whatever you're talking about, historiography on that definition is simply a domain. It's stuff out there. And you can go and read it if you want. And when you read it, what you are going to do is describe what it says. So you can go and read Macaulay's Great History of England, 5 vols, and then tell people what's in it. You can read Thomas Carlyle. You can read any of your great American historians. But what you're going to do at the end of that exercise is simply to describe what's there, or analyze in some sense what's there. Historiography on this definition is simply a thing. I'd like to propose a second definition of historiography, which is not lexicographical at all, and you won't find it in any dictionary. It's a stipulative definition. It's a way of saying, is there a more helpful way to think about historiography and how to study it? And the starting point here is to turn historiography away from being just a dead noun into something like an active verb. to think of historiography as an active, investigative, academic subject, something that one does, rather than something that one simply confronts. Understood in this way, what would historiography amount to? Well, when I teach it, what I'm trying to do with my students is to give them a series of theoretical tools through which they might be able to analyze a given historiographical text. And my students, before they get anywhere near historical writing, have to think very hard about subjects like the nature of historical knowledge, the nature of historical explanation, the nature of historical method and what's involved in it, the place of value structures and ideologies in thinking about historical texts. And then what they do is try to apply that kind of reasoning to the sorts of work that I set them out. I never let them loose on historical texts without having some sort of conceptual way of thinking about what you could do with them. And what you can do with them is to illuminate not only the past that you're discovering, but the present from which the book has been written. And one of the great values of historiography seen that way seems to me to be that it provides a tool for thinking not just about the past, but about the present. And that's why I'm going to urge you towards thinking that perhaps historiography helps us towards a critique of some of these, to me, less than attractive ideas that are circulating very strongly at the moment. Let me be clear, I'm not a critic of studying global world history. I think it's a very good thing to do. It can only be a good thing to do, to study the histories of China and India and Southeast Asia and South America and Africa. Of course it is. The difficulties seem to me to arise when global historiography begins to imply that there's nothing to be said about the West anymore because it's a tired, overdone, stale civilization which has nothing fresh to be said about it. That's the part of the perspective that I don't like. That's what I'm reacting against. If you're going to study historiography, my contention is you've got to study it theoretically. I'm sorry about that. It's not the historian's favorite word, I know. But if you're going to think about it conceptually, you have to start somewhere else. There are questions that you have to ask before you get anywhere near a historical book if you're going to make any sense of what it means. So, the next quarter of an hour is going to be a bit hairy, and I want to lead you into some conceptual issues and into the dark underworld of theory. But at least it's fun. I'll try to make it fun. If I'm going to talk about historical theory at all, you're going to expect me to ask the question, what is history? It's not a bad question. There are some very bad books written about it. But it's the third question. The first question is so difficult that I'm not even going to try to get anywhere with it this evening, though I've tried to write a little bit about it myself in the past. And that question is the most ultimate question of all for any historical thinker. It's Aristotle's question, which he asked but rather unhelpfully failed to answer. What then is time? Now this is remarkable actually, if you think about it. We, the historians, are the only people in the world, with the exception of the cosmologists and quantum physicists, I suppose, who spend our entire lives thinking about the nature of time, except that we don't. Can you name any historian who has spent much time thinking about time I can think of one, the brilliant, innovative French historian Fernand Braudel, who did conceive an original model of how time works, which you can accept or reject, but at least he'd thought about it. And yet there's a real paradox here. The time of professionalization in history, the time when history has become a super-duper big subject in the universities, runs precisely parallel with the time when time itself became the subject of academic speculation, with Einstein, with quantum physics, the whole relativity thing. It's as though history gets written as though none of those people ever wrote anything. There's an odd paradox lurking under that. I suspect it's partly because if you're going to do time seriously, you have to do it philosophically. Historians tend to resile against philosophy. You would have to look very strongly at least two major 20th century thinkers. One of them, the French post-idealist thinker Henri Bergson, and the other, massively difficult German thinker, Martin Heidegger, whose Sein und Zeit, Being and Time, 1927, the unfinished masterpiece, is really something that all historians ought to confront, not as undergraduates, God knows, but perhaps in grad school. But we don't do it. We don't do it. It's ever so hard. I read it 10 pages a day, to plod my way through it. But I think it's a very important thing to attempt. But time itself is something that tends not to come within our conspectors. And for that reason, it doesn't penetrate the historiography. And because I'm concerned with the historiography this evening, I'm going to ease that one gratefully to one side. But if we drink enough after the lecture, I'm very happy to talk to anybody who has interest in it. I'm not going to talk either about what is history, because so many other people have. And when historians talk about it, they tend to lower it away from theory to talk about simply professional protocols. So often that question gets answered by practical historians who begin their books by saying, I don't know anything about theory, I'm just going to tell you what we do. And when you read Richard Evans, or when you read Ludmila Jordanova, you're presented with this kind of picture. Or Lowenthal, The Past is a Foreign Country, the most silly title ever given to a history book. I mean, the one thing that the past cannot be is a foreign country, since we can't go there. So I'm not going to stay with the issue of what is history, but I'm going to suggest to you that there's a very important question that all historians can and should think about very deeply and don't. It's the intermediate question between what is time and what is history. And that's the intriguing but unanswered question, what is the past? And the reason historians, I think, don't bother with that question is that it just seems blindingly obvious. It's whatever happened before I finish the sentence. It's the set of all events in the universe that have happened before now. What's your problem? Problem is that the past is not a thing, it's a conceptual space. And what we do with it as historians, as literary critics, makes a fantastic difference to how we approach the various issues that we raise in the relationship between present and past. There are at least 3 ways of thinking about how the past works. And again, I'm not going to delay too much on the first one because it's comparatively recent, it's extremely interesting, it has to be mentioned, but it hasn't yet developed quite the historiographical pull that the other 2 have, which have a much longer time depth. But that's the idea of the past as a form of memory. Now, it's extremely big at the moment. And the idea is not that the past is constituted by our personal private memories, though of course for us individually it is. It's rather that we should think of the past as a form of collective memory, mémoire collective, or of social memory, or more recently, of cultural memory. And a number of very talented writers want to offer that version of how the past functions. There's a terrific English book, which most of you won't know, I think, but one we've been laughing at since 1930 when it came out, called 1066 and All That. Immortal book by Seller and Nyeitman, the funniest book on history ever written. But its subtitle is All the History You Can Remember. It isn't the proposition that history consists of all the history you can remember. The proposition is that you cannot understand the past unless you see it as acting as a form of collective memory. Not surprisingly, the issue which most preoccupies people in that field is the Holocaust, the Shoah, because it is manifestly an area where tortured, unrelieved memory, unfulfilled memory, is going to play an enormously important part in the study of the subject. It is not an accident that the big journal in that new field, History and Memory, is edited out of Jerusalem. And one sees the enormous importance of it, the attraction of it. But it doesn't underlie the way that historiographical thinking has happened throughout the 20th century. It's a comparatively new field. We're still feeling our way with it. And it's people who've pioneered it, particularly in recent years, Jan Assmann in Germany, that are beginning to make this into a serious way of conceiving the past. Another problem about the history as memory is that it also produces something that history wants to get rid of rather than something that history wants to support, because history, for most people, is not an extension of memory. It's a way of correcting or legitimizing memory. Because very often memories are simply false. Our own, we all know that from psychology, but also collectively. Let me give you two examples. Trivial examples, but they make the point. John Merriman, some years ago, American historian, wrote a marvelous book called The Stones of Balazouk. I don't know if anybody's seen that. Balazouk is a pretty little village in the Ardèche, above the Rhone in southern France. We know that that area was pillaged by Saracens coming out of North Africa and southern Spain in the 9th and 10th centuries. It is perfectly possible that they reached this village of Balazouk. But in Balazouk, they are utterly persuaded, collectively, that they are direct descendants of those Saracens. And they put that fact in their tourist brochures. And it's complete rubbish. And it's the task of history to confute something like that, not, as it were, to adopt it. Another example from memory, up in the Trentino, northern Italy, near Ariosto, there is an area known locally as the Sette Comuni, the 7 townships. This area of the 7 townships has a local dialect, as do so many places in Italy. But this dialect's very special. Italians can't understand it. Germans can't understand it. But Danes can. Proposition: these people must be descended from Vikings. So the notion is, the collective memory of this community is that they are some sort of descendants of a lost Scandinavian people. It's plausible, but it's almost certainly wrong. What history has to do is to hold that up to criticism. Okay, so the remembered past is something that's interesting, plausible, important, but it doesn't play the same role in historiography as the other 2 segments that I want to think about. So let me ease that to one side. The most obvious way to think about the past is the common sense way, the way that most historians actually operate. I'll call it realism. This doctrine says the past is a real entity, it's a real place. It may have gone, but it still exists. It exists in the sense that you can't visit it, true, unless you're H.G. Wells, but you can retrieve events from it, and you can study the past. It's rather important for historians to say it is possible to study the past, because otherwise their subject tends to disappear. So the proposition has to be the past is a real thing, and you can examine it through the means of historical method. And that's what we have been perfecting and developing over the last 150 years. And if you use those techniques, if you learn them, source criticism, evidence, the basis of research, you can, as it were, not visit but retrieve that past. And it's very noticeable that when people use this particular understanding of the past, they normally use verbs beginning re. You retrieve, you recover, you recall, you reconquer, you resuscitate. Above all, favorite of all, you reconstruct the past. It is the task of history on this model to reconstruct the past as it was when it was present. That's a very important condition. The proposition is that it is possible, not only desirable but possible, to form a model of a past in the state it was before it became a past, when it was still somebody's present. And the proposition is that if you don't believe in that, history will at once become impossible or trivial. Now, this model is backed up by many of the forces of our culture. It is dispassionate, it is objective, favorite word in this department. It is scientific. Because on this understanding, the past is rather like a corpse on a table, something that you can dissect. And it brings an awful lot of status to the profession, because it sounds as though we are a form of scientific endeavor, carrying out, as it were, experiments on a past that is somehow available to us. Or to change the metaphor, we are anglers with a fishing line, and you can throw your line into the past and fish events out and bring them back into the present. You can somehow pull the past back into the present and examine it. That's the realist proposition. And what it has at its heart is the idea that there is no difference of principle between the present and the past. The past is merely a present that has slid away. But it should be, in principle, as examinable, as accessible as the present. There are limitations in inquiring into the present. There are limitations in inquiring into the past. That doesn't mean that what you do inquire into is not illegitimate. And if you poke a realist hard and say, I don't believe that you can make the truth claims that you keep making, they always say the same thing. I may not know the whole truth, but I know some of the truth. That's one cameo. Okay, but please put that in one corner of your mind just for 5 minutes and vacate another corner of your mind for a second cameo. I will call this relativism. You might want to call it presentism. Some people who are confused and often mad call it postmodernism. It's important to note that while all postmodernists are relativists, by no means all relativists are postmodernists. a fact often lost in this literature, which is extremely confusing. Relativism is not merely different from realism, it is its exact polar opposite, which is why I choose it by way of examining the spectrum here. It's much more recent in its development than was realism. Realism has been clear as a philosophy of history since, the Enlightenment in many ways. This relativistic frame of mind really begins in the 1920s, gathers pace in the 1930s, and becomes very powerful from about 1975. What does it say? The thing that is most precious to realists is the idea that the past is still there. The thing that relativists believe is that the past does not exist anywhere. It is nothing. And Louis Mink, a very talented American relativist theorist, has a wonderful paragraph where he says, when you first realize that, when it first hits you in the gut, it's not there. There is no there for it to be. It is literally a nothingness. It's one of the most terrible thoughts that can hit you, if it's true. And it's an extremely uncomfortable and difficult thought. Because what it means, if it's true, is that a past is never reconstructed. It is always constructed. It's made. It doesn't exist. It's made on the desk of the historian. You make an image, a picture, a portrayal, a model, whatever you want to call it, but you do it on your processor. It's not there. What you write about it may be true. It's just that you don't know whether it's true. Your task on this reading is to make it plausible, to make it fit evidence that we have in the present, not the past. Stuff that is around us, letters, diaries, physical objects, whatever. But what you do is to produce what one true postmodernist, Frank Ankerschmidt, called in a penetrating phrase, the reality effect. It's your job to make the past seem real through the methods that you have at your disposal. You make it look real when in fact it isn't. You make it real for you, if you like. Relativism, therefore, undermines, corrodes, subverts so much ordinary common sense thinking about how a past is made, where it is it anywhere at all? And for some people, it's completely intolerable as an idea, not just on logical grounds, because one logic says, why should the past be so very different from the present? Why should it be a nothingness? But also on very deep emotional and psychological grounds. Can you really live with the idea that the past isn't there, except as a construction? Or do you just take it as obvious? There are many very young people in the room. You are the postmodern generation. When I teach my students, they're not as appalled as I would have been when I was being taught in the 1960s and 1970s, because we were taught positivism. We were taught about exact historical method, about the presence of a past, about the examinability of the past. When I teach young people, they tend to say, yeah, whatever. It's okay, I can live with that. Okay, it's not there, so what? It's a fascinating psychological shift. But what really brought it home to me wasn't being hit in the gut myself. It was watching someone else being hit in the gut. And that was the man who taught me the history of political thought when I was an undergraduate. A lovely man, a very able man called Preston King. Since I knew him years and years ago, he's produced a collection of essays called Thinking Past a Problem. It's a really nice title. It's a pun. Thinking past a problem in the sense of thinking through a problem. But what he really wants to say is thinking that the past is a problem. And he hates it. For Preston King, the past is not problematic. It's real, it's effective, it's present, in some sense, and it constitutes who you are. And if you lose that, you've lost who you are. Why does it matter to Preston? It can't be philosophy. He writes on Michael Oakeshott, who was one of the best and greatest relativists of his age. It's not that at all. Preston King is black. He left America because he wouldn't do the draft. He was exiled for many years in the UK when he taught me. He's the direct descendant of slaves, about which he's very proud. The thought of losing that in some relativistic nightmare is for him completely unthinkable. The past has to be real in some sense, out of a deep psychological need. So relativism can be an extremely unpleasant way of thinking about how the past works. If you want to think about a very extreme form of relativism, I would come, you see it in Carl Becker and Charles Beard, here in the States, in well-known addresses to the American Historical Association in the early 1930s. You see it in England in Robin Collingwood, and particularly in Michael Oakeshott. Oakeshott's utterly brilliant book, Experience and Its Modes, 1933, which I warmly recommend all undergraduates not to read. I know of one guy who went up to Cambridge and thought he had to read it for his first tutorial, and he simply went home, simply gave up. It's horribly difficult, but my God, it is an astonishingly brilliant book, which relativizes the basis of historical knowledge in particular, something that Oakeshott really believed. But for a very extreme case, I would always want to mention a very cherished friend who is not a postmodernist, but is a hyper-relativist, someone for whom I have the highest conceivable regard, but from whom I usually disagree with some violence. And he's a distinguished American theorist called Hayden White. Now, Hayden is deeply misunderstood. People think he's a postmodern critic of modernity. He isn't. He describes himself, rather unhelpfully, as a utopian Marxist anarchist. He's extremely clever, but he adopts a position of relativism which is way off most people's scale, in denying the existence of a past. The master book came out in 1973, Meta-History. Many historians will have read it. More historians will have thrown it at the wall. A lot of historians regard him as barking mad. I don't. I think he's immensely clever. But what White wants to say is so extreme that he actually doesn't say it. We enjoyed, if that's the word, a completely ghastly lunch in Budapest a few years ago. I remember the menu extremely well. It was goose liver, followed by liver, followed by liver with mango. Only the Hungarians could come up with something like that. But because the meal was so dreadful, we talked a lot. And I was asking Hayden about his views, and he said something to me that stuck with me ever since. I don't think he said it in any of his books, but it's a beautiful example of what I mean. The past, he said, is a place where people dream dreams. Simple as that. It's not there. You project your own imagination into it. Sure, there are sources, there are texts, but David Hume taught us that the intellect is the slave of the passions. What you do on this reading is to make the world come right. You take the particular evidences that you've got and you produce a view that consorts with what you wanted to believe in the first place. Now, I think Hayden's wrong about that, but I use it as an example of a very extreme relativistic position, that the past is a construction. I do agree with him that the past is constructed, not reconstructed. So, 2 cameos to hold in your mind. Now, okay. Complicated intellectual operation. I want you to take those 2 cameos and map them back onto the distinction I began with in 2 types of historiography. If you think about it for a bit, they map in a very clear one-to-one relationship. If you believe that the past is real, examinable, accessible, and that you can make firm truth claims about it, you will cleave to a description of historiography as an activity in a certain way. It becomes a kind of laboratory in which you test out and correct past texts. The point of historiography is to demonstrate error and to demonstrate progress. And this leads into a very dangerous form of Whig susceptibility. Sure, Carlyle wrote a marvelous history of the French Revolution. Sure, Jules Michelet wrote a wonderful history of France. But why read them? For God's sake, they're out of date. We know so much more now. What's the point? Aesthetically, that's great. Read them in the way you would read Shakespeare, because they're great creative works of art. But don't read them to learn more about the French Revolution. We know so much more about it than they ever did, because we've moved on. Historical method has shown us. Understood in this way, historiography becomes, with its sort of pseudo-scientific apparatus, a way of legitimizing our present condition and the way that we impose our particular views on how the past works. So that realist understanding of the past is, for me, not the cure, but the disease. That's part of our problem. If you take the second way of thinking about it, the relativistic way, what happens then? I want to argue that it maps better onto my second understanding of historiography, my stipulative one, that we can see historiography as an investigative activity where we watch the ways in which, language is difficult here, past presents invented their own past. We can see how the present, when it was 1914, looked back on a past that was 1850. We can examine the present that was 1780, and we can think about how it understood the past of 1650. And by doing that, we learn, arguably, something very important. Not so much about the history, the past that's being discovered, but about the present from which it's being constructed. Let me give you an example, which just comes from my background years and years ago. About 50 years ago, when I was young, didn't look like this, one of the great periodicals in Cambridge, a periodical called Past and Present, decided to float a thing called the 19th Century Cromwell Project. Now, I don't know how much you know about British history, but we've got 2 Cromwells, Thomas and Oliver, and neither of them lived in the 19th century. So this was a strange project. But somebody, Brian Harrison and Trevor Aston at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, I'd had the bright idea, why don't we get everybody who works on the 19th century to send in to a common base, common office, every reference they come across to Oliver in this case, Oliver of the English Civil War. And then let's see what we've got. And the proposition was, we won't learn much about Oliver Cromwell, but we'll learn a hell of a lot about the 19th century. We can investigate the present of the 19th century through the past that it constructs. Now that is a model that you can expand. Now, that takes me back really to where I began. I was arguing that I began with a resentment against the overmastering of the past by our present concerns, our sense of a present that is always scientific, objective, civilized, whereas the past it describes is barbaric, enchanted, whatever. There's a kind of patronage involved, which I find rather repellent in many ways. Does this second line of argument about a relativistic past help us? In one sense, not. Because if you don't think the past is there, if you think that it's something that you invent under controlled conditions, which is what relativism is saying, doesn't that make the present even more masterful in constructing a past? And that's true. But it can cut the other way. Because you are taking the proposition that it's interesting to look at past presents and to understand how they function, one of the things you learn very quickly is that presents are temporary, fragile, and often wrong. We look back now at the present of, shall I say, 1810, and we laugh at the way they constructed the history of the 17th century. We never think of laughing at ourselves. What historiography, conceived in the way I've been hinting at, might do for us is to help us to form not only an understanding of variety and difference and richness in the past by breaking away from this monolithic model of sameness, it might also help us to form a critique of the present out of which we make these generalizations. It might make us a little less complacent about the way that we form pictures of the past once we understand how many times in the past a present has been used to get the past wrong. If it were true then, why can't it be true now? Now, of course, all of us, as human beings, are preoccupied when we think about our lives by linking up the present with the future. But when you do that on the basis of scientific historical method, you're going to get a future that looks remarkably like the present. What historiography offers is a past present, not a present future. But looking at that particular junction, past presents in the past, what they can tell us, what they suggest, it may be that we can form a partial critique of where we are now. Historians will not achieve that. Historiographers, through their concern with the relationship between past and present, just might, and perhaps a better, certainly a different, certainly a more realistic future might be the result. Thank you.
there are statements that apply solely to studying how historians in the past have mapped their past, or does it apply to all the historical images that specific question had about the past? Because not all those images are described by historians. Some of those images are just described out of, say, professional creators of history. And just the first issue that you mentioned, which is really what you call historical memory, it also plays a part in that view of the past.
I'm not sure I'm quite with you. You're saying that views about history and memory penetrate.
I'm saying that not only historical images, but what has in the past are described by historians. So that with your historiographic approach to that in the past, apply all to historians, to all those who describe historical images.
It's certainly the case that constructions of the past are not so foundational. It's certainly the case that constructions of the past are not limited to historians, and that the images that are formed often through an entire society, rather than through an elite bunch of historians. That's absolutely right. On the other hand, historiography is concerned with the texts that get generated. And my concern this evening was with the idea of historiography as historical writing, as simply that, the graphy. And therefore I look to the historians as people who, out of a professional interest, develop this kind of thinking. I don't mean to say that they form some sort of elite cadre which will, as it were, lead the revolution forwards. I mean, who cares that much about historians in the wider society? I know that perfectly well. But I'm interested, as an historiographer, I'm interested in the way that historians in particular go about forming these images and the kinds of texts that result. So it's a purely textual thing, for me.
Thank you very much for the fascinating and hugely informative and very stimulating. To tell you the truth, when you laid out realistic and relativist perspectives on history from time and past, I thought in the end we would be going to the Sicilian mean and pragmatic them together somehow. And then you said you're more inclined to see the relativist perspective as more capable of contributing to investigative. That's good. Then clarify for me, how is it possible to hope for a more realistic future? Given the fact that the relativist precisely doesn't believe in the reality of the past, but you still seem to think the hope of getting to the real past.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I see exactly what you mean. I'm sure there is a bit of a tension there in what I was saying. What made me use the word realistic is that I am profoundly skeptical about historians using what I might call decaffeinated views of the past in order to create a future that I think is unrealistic. I had a particular thing in mind there. I don't know if anybody's seen this. There is now an agreed Franco-German view of the 20th century. Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. It's true. Two guys got together, a Frenchman and a German, and they said, I know we've had our fallings out in the past, but surely we can agree on the main... And they've written a book. They've written the agreed Franco-German version of the 20th century. That seems to me complete balls. I mean, how can you possibly do that? And it's this business, again, of wiping out difference. It seems to me that if you think about... what relativism does, I think, is to open up the idea that you can look at past presents in some creative way and show that very often they break down. And when I said a realistic future, I mean one that's not taken in by this sort of rhetoric. Because a lot of the historical work we've got at the moment is written on what seemed to me to be highly optimistic lines towards a very special liberal agenda, a liberal cultural agenda. And that troubles me. And I think it is producing a sense of unrealism. And my own view is that already that is beginning to look extremely frail as our capitalist economies are going into what seems to be some sort of crisis. So, unrealistic in that sense. That's all.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to ask a bit more about collective memory, particularly thinking about what you were talking about with sort of a particular liberal cultural agenda behind this history. Thinking about popular history over the last decades, both in the US and in the UK, we see a very different sort of history that gets published by academic historians to that which gets published by TV corporations or by other. I'm thinking here of series like John Adams, but also moving into collective memory as well. Thinking about Greatest Britons or Greatest Canadians TV series and the votes that have gone around. These aren't entirely realistic propositions, nor entirely relativistic propositions in the mechanisms that you put forward. So I'm wondering where does the role to try and bring collective memory back into this?
I think
where
they
does
are
the role
actually.
of popular thought come into this?
I would have said they did fit the relativistic model. I think they are definitely. I mean, for all the rhetoric, bringing the past alive. God, I hate that phrase. But it's one that television is obsessed with. But what they know what they're doing is producing an image. And what they use actors. They simulate. They make it up. I mean, far more than serious academic work does. They don't worry about the detail, the positivistic side of it. What they want to do is to create this reality thing, the very thing Frank Schmidt was talking about. I mean, certainly the visuals, the Athens series and the rest of it seem to be absolutely to be relevant. And the Teledon approach, watching Sharma walking around the battlements in his Gucci suit, doing this extraordinary thing of projecting a past that he, as an historian, must know is an abbreviation, a way of communicating something valuable because it brings people into history. It makes people who don't like history like history. That's good. But he knows perfectly well that he's creating a reality thing. He's not really doing the stuff that he would do if he sat down to write, another serious book, such as Citizens or the Early Roman Dutch Republic, and that's which I wrote that book. So I think, where I think you're right is that it is a new genre. There is now the need to project pasts at people in a far more full-on sort of way than was ever the case when history was written by a narrow group of scholars with an audience of 500. You can now make the most astonishing reality of things through your television, through your films, and so on. And that's a new thing. I agree. But I don't think it disturbs the epistemology. I think it's manageable in the terms of the sketch that I give.
I was wondering, where is the subversive history? What is subversive history in the way you're thinking about how we go about our business, our profession? That is to say, one could call you a hopeless state alien. And to what extent have really the postmodern condition stripped us of a certain warmth for subversion in a dialectical process? Because nowadays, we can do market conditions, for example, for history that we've all experienced. Your values to be subversive and to be asking concrete questions and so forth, but only within the rubric of acceptance and subversion.
Exactly. No, you have to be within the canon.
Right. So have you been accused of being
we get more people to study historiography, and that's happening, how many of you have done any in college? Are you taught here? You do any historiography? Yeah? Small one. It's happening. It's happening in small scale, but it's happening. And a lot of 101s now in the States, I know use my knowledge, the publishers tell me that historiography is inherently subversive. Once you understand that what it does is to inform you about presence. TS at the end, on presence. And my suggestion is that our present will be subverted when more and more people understand that past presents have also been subverted. It's simply the act of the doing it, I think, was subversive, not a sort of temperamental move. And that, you're quite right, that the postmodern condition is very impervious to being subverted. I don't think that matters. I think it will happen anyway, whatever the moment. And you know, there are acts of subversion. I carried out a wonderful one. My last great public act, I was on the funding council, where people put in for a lot of money. And a woman put in an application for £200,000 to write the history of cake. Now, I was liberal, but it doesn't seem to me that public 200,000 quid, public money, should be spent on the history of cake. And I played a very large part in this topic. I'm absolutely delighted. That was subversive. But the culture is suggesting that that's fine. It's the whatever thing. The history of cake is as good as the history of parliament or class or whatever you want to say. I don't buy it. And that's what I find depressing. There's something very depressing about the way that the culture, to me, seems to be operating. It's probably just because I'm getting very old. And generational things do play into it. But I think there is a want of penetration and seriousness in the culture, and that we should just give into it. Historiography provides time depth, it provides perspective, and it undermines this lazy assumption that the present is always right. And I feel strongly that that's something that should be said.
So why is writing history of cake better? Why is writing a history of Parliament more important than writing a history of cake? You said that you thought that writing a history of cake is a bad use of money. Writing a history of Parliament, writing. So why is writing a history of cake? If you take your historiographical approach, why would it possibly be less important than writing a history of Parliament?
Well,
what's the philosophical under?
I don't think they are. Well, some relativists would argue precisely the line that you're taking. That relativism means that there is no distinction to be drawn between any kind of sort of one project and another. It's just plurality. That's a much more postmodern position than necessarily relativistic. I think it's an abdication of civilized value, and value plays an enormous line in historiographical. I think it's an abdication of civilized values to refuse to prioritize projects. And of course, there's an element, I'm sure the woman was very annoyed that she didn't get the grant, and I'm sure she will have a very good reason for saying the history of cake is fundamental. Doesn't seem to be so to me. And, you know, if we are to retain any kind of control over our agenda, that's what we do, then I think value judgments are implicit. So, I mean, I don't say I need to apologize. I think most halfway sane people would have said something similar.
Can I make sure that I understand your conceptualization before I launch into my bigger question? It's just kind of, so you're suggesting that if we map, and if we take these relativist insights and map that against historiography, we get this more accurate historiography, and through that, seeing how historians in the past have like not gotten the past right, that'll suggest things about the present.
Yeah.
So I guess my problem baseline that allows you to make comparisons and say that they got it wrong. And so how do you account for that? How do you just throw that entirely?
It's a very good question, and it's an extremely difficult philosophical question, because it's manifestly extremely difficult to ditch, as it were, unspoken ground assumptions in what you say. And so much of the realist basic understanding is built into our very language of analysis. An example comes to mind. There's a brilliant book by Stuart Clark called Thinking of Demons. You know that. Wonderful book on witchcraft. And Clark begins with a highly relativistic theoretical preface, which strongly recommend beautiful books. Wonderful. And he says, the trouble with people who write on witchcraft is that they don't believe in witchcraft. I am going to write as though I am going to take the ideas of the witches and the language of witches seriously. And I'm going to try to understand the cosmology in which they live. And I'm going to ditch all our contemporary thinking about it, and to try to understand it in a 17th century way. Fine. I was then sent an article for review by a German Canada, where a philosopher had said, what he's saying is impossible, because you cannot remove the theoretical framework of all 20th century thought and transpose it into some 17th century model. You've got to take that with you. And I think there's a lot of force in what you're saying. Perhaps what that argues, if you're being hopeful, is that there's some means of reconciliation between these two positions. And the reason I didn't do that, and you were making the point about is there a way, is that my students always do it. When I send them an essay on thinking about these positions, they usually say, well, this is realism, and that's relativism, and I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. And that gets very lengthily confused. So I tend to be rather firm in drawing these two things out. But probably there is a necessary reconciliation of the sort, at least in the level of analytical language, without which we can't function. I suppose Ankerschmidt's notion of a reality effect is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to take conventional language and transpose it into a kind of personal medium. I don't know, it's an interesting question. I'll think more about it.
I'm afraid this is a rather big question, and I don't your explanation for your assumption. Is it possible to do this going on without sort of engaging in emotion? I mean, how, or is there a fine line? And could one do this?
I think a lot of people get very close to doing so, yes, in the sense that they tend to conceive the subject as a means of evaluating a past text in the light of what we now know and what we now do. And that's very much the realist view. Rather than trying to understand what it is that made that text the way it was, and thinking contextually around it and situating it, and getting into its language, and so on. So what people will sometimes do is to write, particularly the sort of Plato to NATO surveys, the sort of things that get used in the manual over here. So Ernst Breisach did an enormous history of historiography. There's a very good one, actually, by Harry Elmer Barnes, 1930s, which is equally good. But what they do is to say, chapter 7, the Romantic period, and then they tell you what the Romantic historians believed was this. The trouble with that is the following. So that there's a very strong didactic feel that they're teaching these people. I find it patronizing. I think that they patronize past writers. Now, people who could not begin to get anywhere near someone like Thomas Babington Macaulay write articles pointing out that he got an awful lot wrong. Of course he did. But you have to get inside the mind from it. So I think it is the case that a lot of people do write without a relativistic frame.
Do historiography study without relativism?
Yes.
Could you sort of name some? I mean, I gather from your description of the relativity one that he's not this.
These are absolutely right.
Could you sort of give, I mean, in addition to your own studies, your own history studies, could you give examples of perhaps American historians or American historiographers who sort of practice historiography, who do historiography without sort of unification?
Over here, I would have to go back probably a generation. Elmer Barnes absolutely does. Harry Elmer Barnes, Bryson does. In England, we've got a bunch of them. Richard Evans, although he's very theoretical, I think is very unreceptive to all things politics. The man I've written a biography of, Butterfield, was deeply interested in historiography, but hated the idea of religion. There's a very funny passage in Butterfield's diaries, which I have at the moment, where he'd been to Wilde's lectures in 1962, and he heard Alfred Cottle giving what later became a social interpretation of the French Revolution, universalistic text, and he exploded in his bedroom that night. Pages and pages. Dangerous this is. You know, we mustn't go down this road. Relativizing history is fatal. But he was desperately keen on writing historical.
Two questions. One was that John was dead.
Yeah.
And then secondly, for the undergraduates in the room, you mentioned you don't think that historians sort of practice problems identified as historiography can. But I spent a lot of time engaged in doing history. So in addition to learning more historiography, maybe being a little more humble in the conclusions they draw, I wonder if you could give any takeaway lines for them that they know about pursuit of history in their research.
I'll do the second one. I looked at Gaddis's book, but I haven't got a mental image of it clear enough to say anything very sensible about it. Though I know how very respectfully it is. On your second question, what should undergraduates take away from this diatribe? Take away two things. Skepticism. But skepticism about your present, not just skepticism about people in the past who get things wrong. Two, read some historians. Read some past historians as well as present historians. And start looking at the dates at the front of your histories. Start really seeing, you know, when you write one of your papers and you've got 6 books on your desk, write them down in date order. And just because it's in the paperback doesn't mean that it's recent. I get some wonderful things. You know, as George Dangerfield writes, even though he's been dead for 50 years, be aware of when a text was produced and ask yourself, do I know anything about the period when this was produced? Could it affect? If the past is present dominant, what about the present of this book? When was it written? What's the guy? Where is the author surrounded? What contextualizes the novel? It's learning to think in those sorts of terms that I think is true. You don't have to buy into a particular model of the past or a particular way of thinking about historiography. But if you don't do historiography at all, I think the subject gets very much weakened. And also, it's just much less fun. It's much more interesting to think about who the historians are. And what E.H. Carr said in that terrible What is History? Know your historian before you know your period. Know something about the person who's trying to teach you. Because they're taking you somewhere. They've got an angle. Getting yourself just aware of that, I think, is